on the shoulders of giants.
Welcome back to part 2 of the presentation. Still no conflicts of interest. Last time we left off with a trivia question. Who is credited with designing the first placebo-controlled blind trial? And the answers were Benjamin Rush, Benjamin Franklin, Louis Pasteur, or John Hunter. And for our answer, let's stay in France. We left off in France the last lecture. Pre-revolutionary France. King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette are still on the throne. And Europe is in the middle of the Age of Enlightenment and just abuzz with discoveries. Newton has just discovered the existence of gravity and published his papers on calculus. And Ben Franklin has captured the god's lightning from the sky with his experiments of electricity. And thousands of spectators gathered to watch this inventor named Jacques-André Alexander Charles harness this invisible gas of hydrogen to take flight in the first hydrogen-filled balloon. So when this charismatic Austrian physician appeared on the scene named Franz Anton Mesmer, and he claimed to have discovered yet another invisible force, it didn't seem like it was so far outside the realm of impossibility. And Anton Mesmer's force was one that he claimed coursed through every living being and was the cause and cure of every physical ailment. It almost sounds like the force from Star Wars. Anton called his new discovery animal magnetism. And he first started by trying to heal people with magnets. He soon learned that he didn't need magnets at all. All he needed to do was wave his hands over people's bodies or bottles of water he would thus sell people, quote, magnetizing them, and he could cure their ailments. And many of his patients were young women, and he would put them in bathtubs, and the women would convulse and scream and faint. And Mesmer would wave his hands over them, and he would touch them all in their indecent places, their inner thighs and about their stomach and their abdomens. And in the background, this musician would play a piano or a glass harmonica that gave this kind of eerie sound of kind of like a finger on the edge of a wine glass to his treatment. It was quite a show. Well, he started to attract a lot of followers that were against the monarchy, and King Louis XVI couldn't have this. So he appointed a commission of people to investigate Mesmer and to discredit him. This commission consisted of the father of modern chemistry named Antoine Lavoisier, also the American ambassador to France at the time, Benjamin Franklin, who was a scientist well known in his own right, and also a Dr. Joseph Guillotin. Through the use of blindfolds and screens and placebo in the form of water, which may or may not have been magnetized by Mesmer, they wholeheartedly disproved him, and he was run out of town on a rail. And this experiment that Ben Franklin was part of was the first time that blinding was used to reduce bias in clinical research, yet it wasn't again picked up until the 1950s. And of course, one can't help but see the ominous foreshadowing of Charles Guillotin being included and appointed to this commission by Louis XVI. We've moved from the Italian Renaissance to France and England, where dermatology's development paralleled each other for the most part, and now it's time for Austria to shine. This is the Hospital of Vienna, and it looks as palatial as Versailles. I've drawn heavily on the next few slides from Dr. Lawrence Parrish's work, The Historical Atlas of Dermatology and Dermatologists. I think we all should have a copy of this book. In it, he calls Vienna at this time the Situs Dermatologicus, the place to be for dermatology. And the Habsburg family is still running the show, just like they were back when Fracastoro was writing about syphilis. Vienna shares with Paris and London the distinction of having one of the three great schools of dermatology at this time. And the founder of this school of dermatology in Vienna was Ferdinand Ritter von Hebra. Hebra first organized the dermatologic services in the Vienna General Hospital, and he was inspired by a movement towards scientific dermatology that had already been established in England by Robert Willem, that we talked about last episode, and in France by Jean-Louis Albert. So the Vietnamese school adopted the approach of pathology, which was unique at that time because the other two schools were based more upon the morphology of the lesions. There's an interesting story floating around the internet about von Hebra that's hard to confirm, and it's that when he was a medical student in the 1840s, he was found guilty of grave robbing. He was trying to procure a corpse for his anatomy class. We just take it for granted. We enroll in anatomy and there will be a corpse provided, but oftentimes these guys had to get their own material. Well, the judge who sentenced him to death commuted the sentence when he recognized how bright and promising of a student von Hebra was. And instead, he ordered von Hebra to wear a cord around his neck to remind him of the crime for the rest of his days. And it's difficult to confirm this partly because von Hebber's grandson, who took part in some Austrian revolutions in the coming decades, actually was sentenced to death, so most searches end up with his grandson and not him. In the hospital, von Hebber was assigned to the Department of the Diseases of the Chest, which happened to be stuck beside this little closet for a ward for skin conditions, and it was actually called the rash room at the time. And at the urging of one of his mentors, Rokitansky, who we'll talk about, von Hebber decided to dedicate himself to studying these skin diseases. So he reviewed all the available literature and collected everything he had, and he soon took over the ward and eventually established dermatology as his own department in the hospital. And many of his fellow compatriots and colleagues at the time still based their treatments on humoral medicine, which we talked about in the first lecture. But von Hebber reasoned that skin diseases were related more to local irritations on the surface of the body and not fluids or ill-balanced tumors. It's hard to believe we're in the 1840s and 50s and we're still talking about ill-balanced tumors. But he was able to induce artificial eczema with croton oil, and also is credited with the discovery of scabies at this time. As we found out, Bonomo had actually discovered it 200 years prior to this, but this time when von Hebber described it, the world was ready to hear it. Students from all over the world traveled to Vienna to study under him. He was just a magnet for the entire world. His first textbook, called Textbook of Skin Diseases, was widely popular and translated into a lot of different languages. And he was credited with actually finally dropping the term lepra from the description of psoriasis. Another interesting thing was with Ignaz Semmelweis, who was the doctor who discovered that washing hands would help prevent infections. And we're traditionally taught that Ignaz Semmelweis was a pariah for what he believed, but von Hebber actually realized that there was something there, and he helped promote Ignaz Semmelweis. Two of the people that laid the groundwork for von Hebber to do what he did were Joseph Skoda and Baron Karl Rokitansky. And Rokitansky is considered to be the first full-time pathologist in the Western world. He's an interesting character because he rejected all materialism and had a very philosophical worldview. And he felt that scientists should first consider humans as conscious and free, willing subjects. And he said that the feeling in our own humanity would be lost if physicians regarded human beings purely as research subjects. So he's really one of the first medical ethicists. Rokitansky was also the first pathologist to start describing pathological findings in the terms of food. Remember currant jelly from medical school and such? Well, he would use terms like raspberry jam, puree of peas, and coffee grounds. As I mentioned earlier, von Hebber made Vienna just the magnet for the world to come study dermatology. And you look at his students, and it's just a murderer's row of who's who in dermatology. You have Auspitz, Kaposi, Nesner, Lesser, Pick, Newman, Kebner, and Una. And Moritz Kaposi was von Hebber's son-in-law. He was actually born Kohn. He was born of Jewish origin, but he converted to Catholicism and married von Hebber's daughter, and then changed his name to Kaposi. It's the valley, it's a little river in the valley that he was born into, the Kaposi River. But he did this not to renounce his Jewish faith, but more because he said that there were too many Kohn doctors already working in the area and publishing, and he wanted to stand out in the literature. Kaposi was not only von Hebber's son-in-law, but he was also the heir apparent to the university after Hebber passed away, and Kaposi then took the throne at that point. And I don't think there's a figure alive in dermatology today that had the gravitas that Kaposi had at that time. He was an honorary member or a full-fledged member of nearly every dermatological society on earth. Another famous student of von Hebber's was Paul Gerson Una, and if I could meet anybody out of these lectures, it would be Paul Una. He was a maverick who marched to the beat of his own drummer. And he started his studies at Heidelberg. However, the Franco-Prussian War broke out, and he was sent to war where he was badly wounded, after which he returned to his studies at the University of Heidelberg, where he had probably quite a different perspective on life than some of his tenured professors who were the gentlemen had gone to war. In particular, Una had problems with his thesis and had major problems with one individual, a Friedrich Daniel von Recklinghausen from von Recklinghausen's disease, or aka neurofibromatosis. And the thesis was on the histology and the development of the human epidermis. And von Recklinghausen objected to Una's use of these newly manufactured synthetic kohl dyes and felt it was unnatural. In fact, the exact term that von Recklinghausen used to criticize Una's thesis was it was not in accordance with the principles of science to draw conclusions from fabrics dyed with coloring powders. Una stuck to his guns, though, stood by his thesis. He did make a few small corrections here and there. But this thesis made a name for Una as a maverick that would look at problems in an unconventional manner and come up with original approaches to problems. So then he went to the hospital at Vienna to study with Moritz Kaposi and Ferdinand von Hebra. So not only did von Recklinghausen oppose Una's ideas, but Moritz Kaposi also seemed to have some personal vendetta against Una as well too. So Una gave up this idea of having an academic career, and he decided to join his father back in private practice in Hamburg right after having left Vienna. Una's life was guided by a very heavy spiritual bent, and his motto was art for art's sake. He wasn't motivated by money or prizes or material goods of any kind. In fact, he pretty much invented Nivea cream and ended up giving it away. And since Una was upset with academic life and Una did his own thing, he opened up this private clinic in the forest right outside of Hamburg. And over the years, he added a laboratory and a nice home for his family, and it became known as the Dermatologicum. And it would attract doctors from all over the world that came here to study under Una. He introduced the method of slide projection to identify lesions and to teach students, so we have him to thank for that. And his courses were supposedly better than what was taught at the traditional universities. And he was a really polarizing figure. Having done this earned him the disdain and the hatred of the other dermatologists. In fact, Moritz Kaposi seemed to go out of his way at every step that he could to block Una's applications for professorships or to block his applications for memberships in dermatologic societies. Una's compound stood in the forest outside Hamburg until it was bombed in the Second World War by the Allies. Now it is the land where it sat is called Una Park, and it's known for its beautiful trees, its birch, its hornbeam and pine, and a lot of people like to go tobogganing on it in the wintertime, and people like to sunbathe in the summertime. And having this freestanding compound that taught dermatology outside the system certainly didn't do Una any favors with his colleagues. Nesser would name his dog Una and berate him in public. And then when there was a movement to give Una honorary membership in the Vienna Dermatologic Society, Kaposi opposed it so much so they threatened to resign if Una was named. It wasn't until Kaposi died that this fierce opposition to Una gave way and he was finally recognized, better late than never. He was an honorary member of societies all over the world, America, Rome, Paris, and Berlin. And he successfully tried ichthyol on the Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, who himself went ahead and offered him a title in the German universities. And it's unclear whether or not Una accepted this title or not. I've seen conflicting reports on this. One of the good quotes about Una, and I can't find who said it to save my life, was Una individualistic? In a way, yes, he was individualistic. He despised fraternities and he thought of independence and merit as the true measure of a man. And to support this, remember, he gave away Nivea cream. He insisted on not making money on it, which is not heard of today. Una was a true freelance. He didn't need universities, didn't need corporations or any other organizations to excel. He did it on his own continuous work, his intellect, and his power of observation, and most importantly, he trusted his gut and stuck by what he believed for better or worse. At this time, Japan had still been under their strict self-imposed isolation since medieval times. Well, when American warships entered Indo Harbor in 1853, Japan realized they needed to get with the program and modernize. And the imperial court sent Kinzo Dohai to study with Kaposi and Auspitz in Vienna. So imagine being so renowned in your field that emperors send their people to learn from you. And Dohai went ahead and established the Japanese dermatology system based off of what he learned in Vienna from Auspitz and Kaposi. And Dohai ended up teaching Masao Oda, who'd be my second favorite person to meet out of all of these, because Oda was also a poet and he was an artist as well too. He'd lived off and on in Paris and spoke French fluently at the time, but he did a lot of his poetry under the name Kinoshita Mokotoro. And here's a picture of one of his books he published called 100 Sketches of Flowers. A quote from Oda here's, "The consequence of science and art is global and humanitarian." So I really think Oda was one of the greatest men of his culture in this time. Now we move to the so-called Pope of Medicine, as he was known at the time, Rudolf Ludwig Karl Virchow. And he discovered the cause of leukemia in 1847, and he also discovered that cancer cells had their origin in otherwise normal cells to begin with, a rather monumental discovery at the time. His tie-in for dermatology is a little loose here, but he's such an interesting figure, I wanted to include him. But ochronosis, if you ever get a chance to read his description of when he dissected a 67-year-old man who had, quote, inky blackness of the costal cartilage, it's actually worth a read in the flowery prose that he uses and just the discovery of him, turning over each layer of the tissue. I encourage you to read it. You can find it online. It's pretty easy to find. He was also called upon as an expert witness in a murder case where they were trying to use hair analysis to convict an individual. And he pretty much said hair analysis is bunk. Individual hairs from the same person can look dramatically different, and then hair across individuals can look dramatically similar. So despite what CSI and the TVs use as their plot lines, hair analysis really is bunk. In fact, in 2016, President Obama had a President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology that recommended hair analysis be thrown out, as well as bite marks. It's actually a pretty interesting read, and you realize so much of what passes as forensic science, the science should be in air quotes, because it doesn't hold muster to the benchmark that we hold things to. Virchow was also politically active too. He was part of a progressive party at the time that opposed President Otto von Bismarck. And evidently, Virchow got the best of von Bismarck publicly in an attack, and Bismarck felt affronted. So he sent his people to challenge Virchow to a duel. And so the story is Virchow's at work in his office working on trichinosis, and von Bismarck's assistant comes in with a paper, and Virchow reads it, and he says, "Oh, a challenge from Prince Bismarck, eh? Well, since I am the challenged party, I propose we have a poisoner's duel. I get to choose the choice of weapon since I'm the challenger. And here they are." And he held up 2 sausages that seemed to be exactly alike. "One of these sausages is filled with trichinosis, and it is deadly. The other is perfectly wholesome. Externally, they cannot be told apart. Let His Excellency do me the honor to choose whichever of these he wishes and eat it, and I will eat the other." The validity of this story has been called into question by numerous sources, but like Mark Twain said, never let the truth get in the way of a good story. The first dermatologist in America is considered to be Henry Daggett Volke, and the first person to actually author a textbook of dermatology in America is Noah Worcester, and there doesn't seem to be an existing photograph of this gentleman. In 1836, Henry Volke established the Broome Street Infirmary for Skin Diseases in New York. And then in 1869, the New York Dermatological Society was founded, and it's the oldest continually existing derm society in the world. Doctors James Clark White and Lois Adolphus During were members of the earliest group of scholarly dermatologists that helped put America on par with European dermatology in the 19th century. J.C. White was a formidable Bostonian who studied at, where else? Von Hebra's Institute in Vienna. And he published the first monograph on what we now call contact dermatitis using the poison ivy resin. And if dates are to be believed, we shouldn't call it Darier's disease, we should call it White's disease, because he actually beat him to the punch on publication dates. And During also showed us the proper way that we can extract maximum mileage from a winner, because he published no less than 18 papers on dermatitis herpetiformis. And it's hard to know who the first black dermatologist really was, because what counted as dermatology and when did it count as dermatology, right? But the first prominent black dermatologist is Dr. Theodore Lawless, who started his life in Louisiana but ended up being a doctor in Chicago's South Side and pillar of the community. And due to racial prejudice at the time against African Americans, Dr. Lawless had to bounce around to different colleges for his medical training. For instance, he was at the University of Kansas in 1914, but black students were barred from completing the clinical portion of the training, which was required to graduate. So as a result, he ended up switching to Northwestern University in Chicago, where he completed his MD in 1919. Theodore Lawless published extensively on syphilis, leprosy, and sporotrichosis. Of interest, he was a proponent of electropyrexia, which was artificially raising a patient's temperature and then injecting them with therapeutic medications in order to try to kill syphilis. And although he was an anchor in the community of the South Side of Chicago amongst African Americans, the majority of his philanthropy actually went to Israel. He donated in what would be current dollars $1.5 million to actually start a dermatologic hospital in Tel Aviv. And Dr. Lawless explained that the Jewish people held a special place in his heart because when he was growing up in a poor family in Louisiana, there was a local Jewish peddler that was always kind to his family and would extend credit, and he wanted to pay back the Jewish people for this one person's kind act. We're going to move into some troubling times, the dermatology here, the mid-1900s, and we're going to start with Dr. William C. Black, who selected 23 children and pretty much at random infected them with herpes, just to show that all the different disparate symptoms of herpes were caused by a single virus. And of course, you can't address anything in medicine in the mid-1900s without addressing the Nazi atrocities of World War II. Now, I'm happy I can give this talk remotely because as a bald white guy, I do not want to stand in front of a swastika and have somebody in the audience take my picture. But let's talk about some of these Nazi dermatologists for a minute. Hans Eppinger, associated with the Spider Nevis. After the war, he worked as a physician in the Soviet High Command, even treated Joseph Stalin. And later, he was called to the Nuremberg trials, of course, what came to be known as the doctors' trials, in which only doctors linked to Nazi activities were tried. But before being called to testify, he decided he would eat some cyanide. It's hard to find a bigger supporter for the Nazi regime than Hans Ritter from Ritter syndrome. He's a very political man, quite an enthusiastic supporter of the Nazi regime. In fact, his reputation was further boosted in 1932 when he signed an oath of allegiance personally to Adolf Hitler. He was also a big proponent of Hitler's anti-smoking campaign, which was considered to be pretty medically progressive at the time. He also wrote a book that was popular called German Gold, Healthy Living, and Joyful Work, which sounds like one racist read. For some time now, there's been a group of physicians that are trying to get the term Ritter syndrome replaced with reactive arthritis because A, he wasn't the first person to describe the syndrome, and B, he attributed it to an actual spirochete infection and proposed the name spirochetal arthrosis. And maybe I'm biased because I know he's a Nazi, but he looks right out of central casting for a villain in an Indiana Jones film, if you ask me. Erda Obenhauser was a Nazi dermatologist, and she worked at the Ravensbrück concentration camp, where she carried out, as you can imagine, horrific experiments against the female Jewish prisoners there. And she was the only female doctor to be tried at the Nazi doctor's trial in Nuremberg. She was the personal assistant to Dr. Karl Gebhardt, who was Heinrich Himmler's personal physician. Now, this is a really twisted story I'm getting ready to tell you, and it's twisted even for the Nazis. Adolf Hitler's good friend, who was a high-ranking SS officer, Reinhard Heydrich, sustained some injuries in 1942 from a blast wound that resulted in gas gangrene on his leg. The physician Gebhardt made the decision not to treat it with sulfa antibiotics, and Gebhardt and Ravensbrück and Erda Obenhausen were doing a lot of research with sulfa antibiotics at that time. Well, Gebhardt decided not to treat him, and Hitler's friend died. So Gebhardt tasked the enthusiastic Erda Oberhausen with the job of recreating this blast wound on their female Jewish prisoners. And when they recreated this blast wound on the leg, the overall goal was they wanted to prove to Hitler that they made the right decision in not treating his friend with sulfa. So they stacked the deck against this question. They would rub human feces, nails, glass, anything they could into these leg wounds and then treat them with sulfa and watch the prisoners succumb to the infection, all in an attempt to prove to Hitler that they did the right thing by not treating his friend with sulfa. When the Socialist Nazi Party took over, Jewish dermatologists at universities were just dismissed en masse. Jesner's spot was taken over by Gotron, who was a Nazi sympathizer. Pincus, who we associate with eccrine poroma and the epithelioma of Pincus, as well. Epstein, who developed the concept of photoallergies. Freudenthal, who described keratoacanthomas, and Bieberstein, who developed immunotherapy for warts. All were dismissed from the University of Breslau on the same day. Abraham Buschke was head of the Department of Dermatology at the Rudolf Virchow Hospital when he was deported to a Nazi concentration camp, and we know Abraham Buschke from Buschke's scleroderma, giant condyloma acuminata, and Buschke-Ollendorff syndrome. Karl Herxheimer of the Jarisch-Herxheimer reaction. We had met in the first lecture regarding Paul Ehrlich and the lawsuit around Salverson. However, Karl Herxheimer was already retired by the time the Nazis took power. And in addition to the Jarisch-Herxheimer reaction, Karl Herxheimer also was the first one to describe chloracne. interestingly enough. Well, anyway, he was already retired by the time the Nazis took power, and his friends urged him to leave, but he thought he would be safe in his hometown. I found online a letter that his university, where he was chair of the Department of Dermatology, his university of Frankfurt sent this letter to the Gestapo asking for information on Dr. Karl Israel Hersheimer, just to make sure that they avoid overpayment with him. They asked that Hersheimer should be evacuated. And you can take a moment and read this chillingly euphemistic language for yourself. And he was taken away to the concentration camp, and he arrived about the same time Buschke did. Both of them would die at the concentration camp, but Karl Hersheimer died 3 months upon arrival of starvation and dysentery. My source for these last few slides is The Death of Medicine in Nazi Germany. Whereas the horrible things the Nazis did came out immediately post-war, especially in the Nuremberg trials, the Frankensteinish things that the Japanese, that Imperial Japan was doing at the time, didn't come out till years later, much later, sometimes even the 1990s, primarily because the Japanese bombed and destroyed and executed all of their prisoners before their concentration camps could be liberated, and our government cut a lot of immunity deals with some of their head scientists. Unit 731 was a covert research arm of the Imperial Japanese Army, where they conducted biological and chemical warfare experiments, mostly on Chinese and civilians, and captured Russian POWs. It's difficult to know what medical science, and especially dermatology, got out of this just wanton cruelness. But we did learn a lot from their experiments of the cutaneous symptoms of typhus. They weaponized plague, and they did a lot of experiments with chlorine gas as well. And the puppet master behind all this was Shiro Ishii, who was the commander of Unit 731. Using Shiro Ishii's research, there was a plan in 1945 to launch 5 of the new I-400 class long-range submarines across the Pacific, surface off the coast of San Diego, and launch balloons filled with plague and typhus. And in the event they couldn't launch them, they were to crash into the shore and infect the United States that way. They had successfully killed almost 500,000 Chinese in this manner, so it's a good thing this plot didn't see the light of day. And after the war, just like in Europe under Operation Paperclip, where America was snatching up the German scientists for the rocket program, we were doing the same thing in the Pacific Rim, and Shiro Ishii's immunity was championed by General Douglas MacArthur. Okay, let's leave these dark days behind and move on to therapeutics and diagnostic conversation. So our first trivia question now is, which famous person was one of the first to receive methotrexate? Was it Babe Ruth, Duke Ellington, Charlie Chaplin, or Franklin Roosevelt? And it was no other than the Sultan of SWAT himself, Babe Ruth. When patients ask me, I still have to prescribe methotrexate for step therapy from time to time, which I'm told by many reps doesn't exist anymore, but it sure does in my neck of the woods. So when patients ask me, how long has this medicine been around? I say, have you ever heard of Babe Ruth? But that's a little dishonest because he wasn't actually on methotrexate. He was on a precursor of methotrexate, another folic acid antagonist for his nasopharyngeal carcinoma. And yes, we're going to talk about boring coal tar. I like this photo because so much of our modern world in organic chemistry has boiled out of this primordial soup of coal tar, and that's what this photo reminds me of. And although it may just languish in the back of your sample closet in those little brown bottles, coal tar was discovered in 1665 and was finally used for medical purposes in the 1800s by our old friend Robert Willan. And it was a waste product of the street lamps of London, and no one knew what the heck to do with it for the longest time until Joseph Lister was able to extract carbolic acid, and then he purified that into phenol later on. And of course everyone knows about William Geckerman and the Geckerman protocol, because everyone's had an attending that has regaled them with stories of having to participate in the Geckerman therapy and change the bandages on the patients while they had their inpatient psoriatic folks. Coal tar and coal soot are also carcinogenic, and it was recognized that one of the first occupational related carcinomas was chimney sweep cancer, which was squamous cell carcinoma of the scrotum. Many of these young kids were employed as chimney sweeps before child labor laws in England because they could fit down the little flues there. And when they turned 30, 35, they've developed these super aggressive invasive squamous cell carcinomas of their scrotum. And Percival Potts was the first scientist to bring this up, and like I said, it led to reform of child labor laws. Now we're going to talk about a guy named Sir William Henry Perkins, who's not traditionally recognized as a medical pioneer, but he should be. His story is as good as the accidental discovery of penicillin in that it was another failed experiment that he was sharp enough to capitalize upon. What he did was he was working with coal tar, and he was trying to create quinine to help the British troops with the malaria overseas, because quinine was very expensive back then. Well, he ended up failing to make quinine, but he ended up with this lustrous purple hue in the bottom of his test tube that he used to stain a silk cloth with. And in doing so, he accidentally discovered the first modern synthetic dye. His color was mauve or purple. And prior to Henry Perkins here, if you wanted to dye something purple, you had to do it the exact same way that Roman senators did it in ancient times. You had to get some Tyrian purple from a snail that existed off the coast of Lebanon, and it was extraordinarily expensive. Because besides Tyrian blue, the natural dyes you had were things like saffron and iodine. Now all of a sudden, with the synthetic dyes, you had fuchsin, you had aniline blue, you had eosin. And then you can see where this is going. Hans Christian Graham uses crystal violet when he makes the Grand stain. And Paul Ehrlich figures out methylene blue and develops the term chemotherapy. And this is where it ties into our very first lecture, where Paul Ehrlich figured out that he could make a so-called magic bullet, in that some tissues exhibited selective affinity for certain dyes while others didn't. And remember from earlier, when von Recklinghausen chided Paul Unna for using, quote, being improper to draw conclusions from fabrics dyed with coloring powders. Well, all of this is because Sir William Henry Perkins was trying to manufacture quinine. This is a plaque outside the Institute where, as a medical student, Paul Ehrlich discovered the mast cells. And his institute was conveniently located right next to one of these adjacent synthetic dye factories. And he discovered that using this alkaline dye, these granules would die inside these cells. And he termed these cells mast cells, from the German word meaning animal fattening feed or mast. And according to Google, the German word mast denotes a fattening or a suckling function. And actually, when he saw these aniline positive cells in the connective tissue, he named them mastazillin cells, which to me sounds like a Godzilla monster. Here is a sample of Perkins' original mauve dye. We owe a lot to this. And this was a dress that was Queen Victoria's, which was stained with his dye that has kept its luster over the years as well. Hyde Park, London was an exciting place to be in 1851 because the original World's Fair was held there in this structure called the Crystal Palace. And new techniques in making sheet glass along with wrought iron made the construction of this 1 million square foot exhibit hall possible. Queen Victoria presided over the opening, and anybody who was anybody in Europe came here to see the exhibits. And one of the exhibit was by James Arnott and his brother Neil Arnott, who actually is the inventor of the waterbed. And they had been practicing cryotherapy since 1845, and they exhibited here at the Crystal Palace for the first time. It's incredible to think that cryotherapy has been in use since before the American Civil War. Now, they used a salt solution that went down to negative 18 degrees Celsius. It was a very cumbersome and not a practical device to use, so it never caught on. Here's what the Crystal Palace looks like today, and here is an artist's rendition of how it looked when it was in all its glory. Our next advancement in cryotherapy involves liquid air, which is negative 190 degrees Celsius, and it was by Dr. Campbell White out of New York. And at the time, there were some automobiles that would run actually just on this liquid air. And Dr. White would treat everything from lupus, erythematosus, to herpes zoster, chancroid warts, pretty much everything with this liquid air. And he would even treat poison ivy dermatitis and published a few articles on it. Some photos of Dr. White treating his patients. He had a brass roller. He had this little spray applicator as well. I'd hate to think of the hypopigmentation that occurred in the patient on the right. In Chicago, there was a doctor named William Pusey, and he was the first and only dermatologist to ever be president of the AMA. He made the next advancement. In fact, he would start using solidified carbon dioxide, known as carbon dioxide snow. And this was actually pretty easily obtainable because it was a refrigerant that was used in soda fountains at the time, which were a fairly new invention. But he would also treat everything from warts and nevi to lupus, erythematosus, as well as lupus vulgaris. In 1961, liquid nitrogen came into use. It became more readily available after World War II. And there was a neurosurgeon named Irving Cooper who teamed up with an engineer named Arnold Lee, and they built the first cryosurgical probe that became the prototype for everything going forward. And Dr. Douglas Torre from Cornell not only helped describe the Muir-Torre syndrome, but also helped develop the field of dermatocryosurgery. And he took the freezing techniques from the operating room into the doctor's office. Experimented with all sorts of cryoprobe tips of various shapes and sizes and converted the conduit line into a closed system in 1965. Now, this is a copy of the patent from 1970 got it off Google Patents of the first modern handheld closed system liquid nitrogen device that's the prototype of what we use today. Many of you probably actually still have this in your office. It was by Sertag Zakarian. In 1952, Merck gave Marion Sulzberger and Victor Witten crystals of this compound called factor F, which was hydrocortisone. And they experimented with dissolving it in several different bases and published the first papers on treating atopic dermatitis with topical hydrocortisone. Hydrocortisone eventually went over the counter in 1979 in a 0.5% compound. Marion Sulzberger, or aka Mr. Dermatology, as he called himself, was an interesting character. He was born quite wealthy, and he's either dropped out of Harvard or he was kicked out of Harvard. He and Harvard decided to part ways at any rate. And he ended up going to Australia, and he worked as a camel driver and also worked at a sheep ranch in Argentina. He was a pilot in World War I. He was kind of a Teddy Roosevelt type figure. And then he got accepted to medical school in Switzerland after just having had a few semesters of Harvard, the kind of admissions that really well-connected, wealthy people evidently get to enjoy sometimes. But he studied derm in Zurich, and he learned how to patch test and brought that back to the United States and became one of the leading publishers, one of the pioneer publishers on immunodermatology. After World War II, he published Skin Sensitization to Vesicant Agents of Chemical Warfare in the Journal of Investigative Dermatology, which he found. The purpose of the study was to find if there were any race-based differences that existed in black, whites, and Asian skin and see if one would be more resistant to mustard gas than the others. And he made the conclusion that blacks were more resistant because they, quote, had thicker skin than whites. And he later walked this back and concluded that all human skin is equally sensitive to mustard gas. And the purpose of these studies was to find out if there was a perfect, quote, ideal chemical soldier they were looking for, because they were worried the Japanese and the Nazis were going to use mustard gas on our troops. And the main problem with these studies is he didn't get consent from any of these Navy sailors that he used, and the Department of War didn't classify these tests as human experiments, so consent was not necessary, and many of these men were directly ordered to participate against their will. These documents weren't unclassified until 1993, and actually NPR was the one that broke the story. And Sulzberger had no record of any race-based views before or after the war, but it's chilling to consider how quickly some of our scientists and our military embraced using human test subjects in racial studies. Meanwhile, the Nazis and the Japanese are overseas doing the same thing. Now let's take a look at the pioneer women of dermatology. And to save time, since we're running out of it, I'm just going to tell you Walter Shelley is the answer to this question on who founded the Women's Dermatology Society. So who was the first female dermatologist? I honestly don't know, nor does anyone else seem to know. It depends on who you read and what you want to believe. There are a lot of historical discrepancies and semantic arguments for this person or that person. But Rose Hirschler, name is often thrown out there. She didn't go to any undergraduate school. She actually had a massage certificate from Sweden and then ended up enrolling and getting her MD at the Women's Medical College of Philadelphia. She went to Central Europe for her derm training, worked alongside Una at his compound, and then came back and worked with Frank Schomburg in Philadelphia. She was the second woman certified by the AAD. Joy Cummings was the first. And the first, if you're curious, the first woman certified by the AOCD was 1982, Dr. Lori Wool. Other people maintain that Daisy Orleman was the first female dermatologist. She was the first woman to present a case at an international meeting, the first to publish a scholarly paper, and the first to actually have a documented clinical practice in the U.S. With the outbreak of World War I, Daisy volunteered her services to the French Army, and then when America entered the war, Daisy joined the United States Army as a surgeon, and at the end of the hostilities, she was decorated by both countries. Later on, she campaigned alongside Margaret Sanger to promote birth control, and I found reports that she actually served for a time as the acting Surgeon General of the United States. For her service in World War I, France actually awarded her the Medal of Honor. How Dr. Daisy Robinson is not more well known today, I don't know. In 1954, Madge Macklin and Helen Ollendorff Kurth described the Kurth-Macklin syndrome of ichthyosis Macklin was an American geneticist who later set up the Canadian Eugenics Society. But Helen Ollendorff Kurth, what a powerhouse. She and her husband migrated to New York due to rising German anti-Semitism. And she did a lot of original work, acanthosis nigricans, and then Kurth's criteria for the diagnosis of paraneoplastic pemphigus is still listed in Bologna and still relevant today. And she was one of the first derms to have an interest in genodermatosis specifically. And she's one of the few dermatologists to actually have an eponym syndrome with her maiden name attached, the Buschke-Ollendorff syndrome, dermatofibrosis lenticularis disseminata, as well as an eponymic sign, the Ollendorff probe sign, which was extreme sensitivity to syphilitic lesions with the pressure of a dull probe, but no one uses that anymore. Sadly, she developed Alzheimer's and passed away in 1982, donating her brain to Columbia for research on amyloid plaques. And we all know the Sister Mary Joseph sign. Well, this is Sister Mary Joseph. She was born Julia Dempsey, and she was a surgical assistant to William Mayo. And we have Sophie Spitz from Nashville, and after World War II, she went to Memorial Sloan Kettering, where she described the 12 cases of what was then known as juvenile melanoma, and she documented, of course, the benign nature of these lesions, and her article was published in the American Journal of Pathology in 1948, and of course, the lesion still bears her name. Sadly enough, Sophie passed away at the age of 46 of colon cancer. We're going to end today with Gertrude Trudy Elion, who was from Manhattan, New York, and grew up in the Bronx with her Lithuanian father and her Russian mother. And she touches our everyday lives, and we have never heard of her name. She's an amazing figure. After watching her grandfather die of stomach cancer, she decided that she was going to go into science. So she went to Hunter College. There was an all-girls school in Manhattan, and she majored in chemistry. She graduated with high honors in 1937. Afterwards, though, when she went into the job market, being a woman, she couldn't find anything. The only jobs they would hire her for were these tedious tasks like measuring the acidity of pickle juice in pickle jars. So she got restless because her work was just so competitive and it didn't amount to anything. She ended up meeting George Hitchens at the Burroughs Wellcome Company, where she spent the rest of her career. And she never went back and completed her PhD. Yet she received the Nobel Prize, and she was known as the Queen of Purine. She was instrumental in developing acyclovir, azathioprine, AZT, trimethoprim, allopurinol, and mercaptoprine. So Ms. Elion, on behalf of all of us that prescribe your medicines every day, may we say thanks. And this concludes our talk today, but for our AOCD members, I want to end with a little lighthearted nugget of fun about our founder, Dr. Albert Ulbrich. Many of you probably know he was a well-published botanist out of Michigan, but probably you don't know that he was a prize fighter prior to becoming a dermatologist. And I scoured the internet to find this little fun article. This is my best 1930s commentator voice. Albert Ulbrich, son of Mr. and Mrs. Otto C. Ulbrich of 1065 East Broad Street, a former Westfield High School football star, won the amateur heavyweight boxing championship of West Virginia recently when he scored a knockout over Mike Ivanhoff of Morgantown, West Virginia. The local lad, who had graduated from WHS in 1930, is a student at Salem College. His victory over the Morgantown boxer came in the second round of the main bout, he coming from behind to batter his rugged opponent into submission. Sports writers who witnessed the bout declared Ulbrich carried himself like a comer. I hope you've enjoyed the presentation today. It's been fun to put together, and I was excited to share this with you. And I hope you've gained some historical perspective on why we do what we do on a daily basis. And it doesn't hurt from time to time to look down at your feet and see whose shoulders you're planted upon. Thank you for listening.